Hi class, I hope that you're each doing well. Welcome to our video on social psychology where you're going to be learning about compliance, conformity, and obedience. So what will you be learning about? You're going to be learning about the power of social pressure. Sometimes pressure is very covert, it's very hidden, and other times pressure is very obvious. So we're going to be learning in this video about compliance, conformity, and obedience. So you're specifically going to be learning about something called the foot in the door technique and the door in the face technique. You'll also be learning about Ash's well-known study on conformity. And then you're going to be learning about Milgram's research on obedience. And by the end of this video, you'll understand how you can resist some of the demands from an authority. Let's start out by looking at conformity. There's a very well-known study that's described in your book that was conducted by Solomon Asch. So Solomon Asch was interested in studying conformity, and conformity happens when people yield to real or imagined social pressure. And Solomon Asch conducted what is today known as a classic study in psychology, and he demonstrated that people conform easily to wrong answers, as you've read in your textbook, given by others in a mock perception test. Be sure to read in your textbook about Solomon Asch's study. But what I'm going to do now is I'd like to spend some time reviewing that study with you. How do you view yourself? Do you view yourself as a conformist or a nonconformist? If you're like most people, you probably see yourself as a nonconformist, enough to stand up to a group when you know that you're right, but perhaps conformist enough to blend in with the rest of your peers. Think about things like wearing clothes to school, or facing forward when you're in a classroom, or standing in line when other people do. So those are perhaps some very basic things that we do that involve conformity. But you probably think that when it comes to important things or when it comes to just things that are not related to social norms, that you're probably willing to just go along with what you see to be true, what you think is right. Well, imagine yourself in this situation. You've signed up to participate in a psychology experiment where you're asked to complete a vision test. Seated in a room with other participants, you're shown a line segment, and then you're asked to choose the matching line from a group of 3 segments of different lines, just like you see here. The experimenter asks each participant individually to select the matching line segment, and on some occasions, everyone in the group chooses the correct line. But occasionally, the other participants unanimously declare that a different line is actually the correct match. And it goes against what you know to be true, based on what you're seeing. So what do you do when the experimenter asks you which line is the right match? Do you go with your initial response? Or do you choose to conform with the rest of the group? So for example, in this task that you see here, if you know that line 2 is the same as the one above, do you go with that one? Or if the other group members are saying that it's line 1, do you go along with them? So conformity refers to our individual tendency to follow unspoken rules of behavior. And this has to do with the unspoken rules that are present in a social group to which we belong. Now, in this case, we belong to the group that we're sitting with. We belong to them because we're all part of an experiment. At least we think that we are. So researchers have long been interested in the degree to which people follow or rebel against social norms. And Asch was interested in looking at how pressure from a group could lead people to conform, even when that individual knew that the rest of the group was wrong. So the purpose of Solomon Asch's studies was to, or what the purpose of it was to demonstrate the power of conformity in groups. So exactly how was his experiment conducted? Well, in each experiment, a naive student participant was placed in a room with several other people who were called confederates. Confederates are people who are in on the experiment. And these naive participants were told that they were taking part in a vision test. And there were about 50 students who were part of Ash's experimental condition. The Confederates were all told what their responses would be when the line task was presented. So the Confederates, again, they were in on the task, and they were told in advance how they needed to respond. Now, that naive participant had no idea that the other students were not real participants. After the line task was presented, each student was verbally announced which line matched the target line. Was it line 1, line 2, or line 3? And you can see here, it's clearly line 2. So there were 18 different trials in the experimental condition, and the Confederates gave incorrect responses in 12 of them. And this is where these were the trials that Ash called critical trials. The purpose of these critical trials was to see if the participants would change their answer in order to conform to how the others in the group responded. What would you do? If people that you're in a group with are saying it's line 1, would you go along with them? Or would you go along with what you knew to be true? So during the first part of the procedure, the Confederates answered the questions correctly. But then eventually they began providing incorrect answers based on how they had been instructed by the experimenters. Solomon Asch also had a control condition, and he did this in order to ensure that the average person could accurately gauge the length of the lines. The control group was asked to individually write down the correct match. So they wanted to make sure that everyone who was looking at these lines knew what the correct answer was, that they could actually tell what it was, that it was not an ambiguous or unclear task. And what they found was that participants were very accurate in their line judgments, choosing the correct answer 99% of the time. Here's what's interesting though. Nearly 75% of the participants in the conformity experiments went along with the rest of the group at least one time. So 25% did not, but 75% did. The experimenters also looked at the effect that the number of people present in the group had on conformity. So when just one other Confederate was present, there was virtually no impact on participant answers. The presence of two Confederates had only a very small effect, and the level of conformity seen with 3 or more Confederates was much more significant. What's also interesting is that after combining all of the trials, the results indicated that participants conformed to the incorrect group answer about 1/3 of the time. So there was approximately a 33% conformity rate, much higher than what would have been anticipated, and probably much higher than if we were in a real class setting and I asked each of you how many of you would conform. This rate of 33% of that rate of conformity, we would find that you all would probably have a much lower number than that. You would anticipate your behavior to be much different than that. So Ash also found that having one of the Confederates give the correct answer while the rest of the Confederates gave the incorrect answer, that this dramatically lowered conformity. So this one individual we could call a dissenter, because in this situation, just 5 to 10% of the participants conformed to the rest of the group. Later studies have also supported this finding, and this suggests that having social support is an important tool in combating conformity. So what do the results of the Ash conformity experiments reveal? Well, at the end of the experiments, what Solomon Asch did and his fellow researchers is they asked participants why they had gone along with the rest of the group. And in most cases, the participants said that while they knew that the rest of the group was wrong, they didn't want to risk being ridiculed. A few of the participants said that they actually believed the other members of the group were correct in their answers. So these results suggest that conformity can be influenced both by a need to fit in and a belief that other people may have more knowledge about something than you do. So given the level of conformity seen in Ash's experiments, conformity can be even stronger in real-life situations where a stimulus is more ambiguous or more difficult to judge. So let's just imagine for a moment if we were to make lines 1 and 3 much taller, or longer, I should say. If we were to make them much longer to where they were very close in length to line 2, we'd probably find a higher rate of conformity because the task is more ambiguous. Here, the answer is clear. But what if the answer wasn't so clear? It makes sense why we would have a higher rate of conformity. So what factors tend to influence conformity? Well, first, conformity tends to increase when more people are present. But as you've read in your textbook, there's little change once the group size goes beyond 4 to 5 people. So we don't need more people than that to increase conformity because it's not going to cause any real increase. Conformity also goes up as a task difficulty or the level of difficulty goes up. So in the face of uncertainty, we turn to other people for information about how to respond. Conformity also goes up when other members of the group are of a higher social status. So when people view the others in the group as more powerful, maybe more influential or knowledgeable, they are more likely to go along with the group. Conformity tends to decrease, though, when people are able to respond privately. So research has shown that conformity decreases if people have support from at least one other person in a group as well. So why do people conform? We talked about this, but there are some important concepts. We have what's called normative influence and informational influence. Normative influence happens when people conform to social norms because they're afraid of negative social consequences. We know that people conformed in the Solomon Asch study because of this, and some indicated that they wanted to be liked. They wanted to be a part of the group. And then we have what's called informational influence, and we talked about this. This happens when people look to others for how to behave in ambiguous or unclear situations. And we can relate this back to the last example, if a line isn't clearly very different from the others, or let's think about real life situations where you really don't know where you stand on an issue, or in an eyewitness testimony, maybe you and another person witnessed an event, but you don't have a great memory for the event. And so you might be more likely to go along with that other individual. But keep in mind, one other person, you don't have that much of an increase in conformity. But as we go up in numbers, up to 3, 4, and even in some of the replicated studies, up to 7, you'll find that increasing rate of conformity. So the more ambiguous the situation, then you add these other factors in, then the greater the likelihood of conformity. Something very interesting that Solomon Asch found was that conformity rates went way down when there was the presence of what he called a dissenter. So if we go back to Solomon Asch's original study, where he had the participant and 7 confederates, 7 people in on the study, what he did was he asked one of the confederates to intentionally give the right answer and for all of the other ones to give the wrong answer. And what he found was that when there was this dissenter, the person who was giving the correct answer, he found that that participant was much less likely to conform. So what does this tell us? This tells us about the power of the dissenter. It tells us that dissenters are not only powerful, but that other people who may not want us to go against what is the commonly held belief or commonly held way of behaving or doing things that. So your book suggests some ways for you to resist conformity. Some of you may know these things, but I think it's important for you to sort of to revisit them because we all are susceptible to the power of social pressures. We might think of ourselves as nonconformists, but given the certain situation, we may be likely to conform. So 1, pay more attention to social forces that are operating on you. Then, as we talked about with the power of a dissenter, identify someone in the group whose views match yours. Now, if you're going to be going somewhere where there's a message that you think is going to be conveyed that is revolving around an issue where you don't have much clarity, or perhaps where you have a different point of view, it's important to bring along a friend with similar views if you know that you're going to confront that pressure. So what is the difference between conformity and compliance? So let's take a look at each of these. As you've likely read in your textbook, The fundamental difference between conformity and compliance is that compliance involves people going along with an explicit request, whereas conformity involves people adhering to unspoken rules. So we comply with people's requests often because we want to be seen as helpful, but we conform to social norms or group norms because we might want to be liked, we want to fit in, we want to avoid negative responses from others who are present, or like we talked about, because the situation is ambiguous. So an example of compliance would be someone agreeing to a request from a local community organization to put up a drive safely sign in their yard. And as your book describes, there are a variety of techniques that people can use to make us more likely to comply with these types of requests. Let's take a look at some of these. Let's take a look at some compliance tactics. So first we need to think about what's called the consistency principle, and that is once people agree to something, they tend to stick with it. So two common techniques that are based on this consistency principle are the foot in the door technique and the lowball technique. So the origins of the foot in the door technique come from door-to-door sales. So we see some door-to-door sales today, but certainly not to the extent that we used to. And the thought was, if a salesperson could get into the door, into your home to sell a product, they were much more likely to sell the product than if they weren't able to get inside. So think about someone selling a vacuum cleaner. If they could get into your home and show you the vacuum your floors, you were much more likely to buy the product than if you'd never let them into your house. So the principle is you start by asking someone for something small, and if they comply with the first small request, then they're more likely to respond to the next bigger request. And it's interesting, this study was, or this type of theory or concept, I guess you could say, was examined beginning in the 1960s and in psychology where it was officially studied. I mean, it was used prior to that, but there were some original studies in the 1960s involving this. So in one of the first studies that was published about the foot in the door technique, this was in 1966, there was an article that was called Compliance Without Pressure, the foot in the door technique. And it began with a question, how can a person be induced to do something that they would rather not do? And then the authors of the article went on to explain some of their experiments. And first what they did is they asked a group of people for a small request by phone, and then they later asked them for a larger request in person. The small request made by the phone was for participants to report on what type of household cleaning products they used. Then the second and bigger request was for the participants to allow the researcher into their home to examine their household products, brands, and usage. So interestingly, and as you can imagine, based on this technique of the foot in the door, when compared to the foot, when you compare the control group, who was merely asked for, who was merely just asked for an in-home product analysis, the subject or participant who had first responded positively to the first request was much more likely to respond positively to the second request than the one who was just given the second request. So getting that first request was very important in order for the second request to be agreed upon. And so then there was a second experiment, and what they did is the authors of this study, they asked participants to display a small sticker in the window of their home or their car promoting protection of the environment or safe driving. And so that was the small request. Then what they did is they asked the participants for a larger request to display a billboard sign in their yard with the same message. And what was really shocking is that many of the participants responded positively to the second request. And so the participants were responding to the second request, if you think about the foot in the door technique, because they had already complied with the much smaller request. So the second request was big, putting a billboard in your yard, and because they'd already complied with that first request, there was a greater likelihood that the second one was going to work. So in nearly every experiment, this foot in the door technique seems to work. So first what happens is, again, make a small request, and then they're, make a larger request, and people are more likely to accept. So, you could think about today where we have political campaigns. A political candidate might ask people in attendance at a rally to wear a pin or to promote their campaign, and then later they might ask them for a campaign donation. Another might be a group of women who may agree to a short health survey and then later on agree to breast cancer screening. Another would be, a group of website visitors who might agree to give canned goods to a disaster relief charity, and then later they're asked to volunteer their time at the charity's headquarters. So this is a very effective way to gain compliance. Let's take a look at the lowball technique. So the lowball technique is a very persuasive tactic that's frequently used in selling a variety of products. So typically the salesperson will offer an item at a below market or average market price to the buyer, and then the buyer may agree to make a purchase or come close to committing, and then the seller increases the price without warning. So it may appear to be a low tactic, but when it's done artfully, it's been known to work in some markets. So think about buying a car. You go to purchase a car and you see the sticker price, you might negotiate the price with the salesperson, and then when you go in to purchase the car, you've been sitting in the in the waiting room waiting for the salesperson to come back in. They're getting all of the paperwork, this part is aligned with the foot in the door technique because they've got you sitting there for a while. And then they come back and they begin to show you all of the additional things you're going to need to pay for. And they're going to tell you about how these are standard fees, and most people don't have a problem with it. If you'll notice, most people buy cars all the time, and this is those standard fees aren't often provided at the very beginning of the sales process. So there are some more subtle ways too that this technique is used. So for example, to get a customer interested in a deal, and then they simply accept that it's a very good deal, and then there's a few tacked on fees. So let's say that a service provider quotes $49.95 a month, but then adds a service charge and a miscellaneous fee. Or let's say, buying a property, you might have additional fees like finder's fees, commissions, or some other fees. So the buyer sees that the final price is increased, but has tolerated it because the price differential wasn't that great, and there was also a logical reason for the price increase. What's really happening here too is that there's a contrast effect, and this contrast effect is the size of the large request makes the smaller request seem even smaller in comparison to. So if you look in your textbook, you'll see how these can be differentiated. We have the foot in the door technique with the small request first, and then we have the door in the face technique with the large request first. Think about sometimes when you've used these, or when someone has used these and you've complied. One other one I want to mention that many of you have probably seen, because many of you may shop on Amazon or have, is Amazon's Today's Deals. That's one that I think of because whenever I've gone there, I see that there's often a time limit and there's a percentage that is remaining. And so you have this sense that if you don't purchase it quickly, they're going to sell out. Whether or not there is a limited supply, we really don't know. But it can be a very effective technique. So people don't have the time to really think about whether or not they need that product. They are more likely to make that impulse purchase. Let's take a look at obedience. So why is it that so many people obey when they feel coerced? A social psychologist that many of you have likely heard of, named Stanley Milgram, researched the effect of authority on obedience. He thought that people obey either out of fear or out of a desire to be cooperative, even when acting against their own better judgment or their desires. Think of a time when you've done that. Think of a time when you've acted against your own better judgment or went against what you wanted to do simply because someone seemed to be in a position of authority and was telling you to do something. Why did you do this? This might have been something that you would normally never have done. And here we see the power of the presence of an authority figure. And that's what Milgram was interested in studying. So I would encourage you, as you think about this study, as you read about it in your textbook, as you read about other studies, I would encourage you to take note of the different theorists' names. And I would encourage you to seek out books that are written by these original researchers and theorists. So for example, the study I'm about to talk about that was done by Stanley Milgram is discussed in his book called Obedience to Authority, an Experimental View. It was written in 1974 by Stanley Milgram, And it's really interesting, I think, as a student in psychology or as a student in any field, to read the original works of a researcher, of a scientist, of a theorist, of a philosopher, if you want to really get that pure view and pure learning experience rather than through the lens of someone's interpretation. And that's what you tend to get in textbooks. Textbooks are great. They provide you with a wealth of information, but it's so helpful if you can read the original theorist's work. And I would encourage you to do that. Think about people like Freud, Piaget. We talked about Solomon Asch. Think about some of the scientists you've read about in other classes that you're interested in, or philosophers that you might be interested in reading. So let's get back to this. And Milgram recruited participants for his experiments from many walks of life. And the respondents were told the experimenter would study the effects of punishment on learning ability, and they were offered a small cash award for participating. So although the respondents or participants thought they had an equal chance of playing the role of student or of teacher, the process was rigged. So all respondents ended up playing the role of teacher. The learner was an actor working as a confederate for the experimenter. Remember, a confederate is someone who is in on the study. The teachers were asked to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to the learner when questions were answered incorrectly. So in reality, remember, this is very important to remember, that the only electric shocks that were delivered in the experiment were small 45-volt electric shock samples that were given to the teacher. I mean, that's small relative to the possibility of what you look in your textbook of up to 450 volts. And the reason that Milgram did this is because he wanted the teachers to have a feeling of what those jolts of electricity were like that they were discharging, so that they could really understand what was happening when they moved past that 45 volts and moved up to, if they did, 450 volts, what that meant. So the shock levels were labeled from 15 to 450 volts. If you look in your textbook, you'll see that there were some verbal anchors that were added to the instrument that gave this real kind of scary appearance. And it began with the lower end, where jolt levels were labeled slight shock, and then moderate shock, and then strong shock, and then very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and then there's danger, severe shock, and then past that were these 3 X's to indicate how terrible that shock level was. And so in response to these supposed jolts, the learner, remember, who's the confederate, they begin to grunt at 75 volts. Now, I want to stop here and just mention, too, that the learner was reading a script. And so for every single participant that was in the study, they responded in the exact same way. So remember, the confederates in on the study, they're responding the exact same way every single time. So again, they would begin to grunt at around 75 volts, and then they would complain at 120. They'd ask to be released at 150, and they'd plead with this real increasing vigor. And then they'd let out these agonizing, terrible screams, if you watch the video of this, at 285 volts. And then eventually, in desperation, the learner would yell loudly and complain of heart pain. And then at some point, the actor would refuse to answer any more questions. And then finally, at 330 volts, the actor would be totally silent. And that is, if any of the teacher participants got that far without rebelling first. And many of you, as you're hearing this, are thinking, how did anyone get up to 330 volts? Well, you're going to see how many did here in a moment. So the teachers were instructed to treat the silence as an incorrect answer and to keep on applying shock to the next level. So ask yourself, would you be willing to do this? Would you be willing to shock someone with electricity for giving an incorrect response when they're complaining of heart pain, when they're asking to be released, when they are no longer responding because someone who is an experimenter is telling you that you need to do so? Most of you would probably say no. So ask yourself too, what do you think was the average voltage given by teachers before they refused to administer further shocks? And what percentage of teachers do you think, if any, went up to the maximum of 450 volts? Do you think many did? Did hardly any do that? So the results, some of the teachers refused to continue with the shocks early on, as you've read in your textbook, despite urging from the experimenters. The experimenter is saying things like, we must go on for sake of the experiment. They're not doing anything, the experimenter is not saying anything that is threatening or aggressive. They're just making those statements. And this is the type of response that Milgram expected to be the norm. So he expected that lots of people would, or the typical response was that people would, they would stop shocking. But Milgram was really surprised to find that those who questioned authority were in the minority, and that 65% of the teachers were willing to progress to the maximum voltage level. So if you watch the original footage that I have on D2L, and you can also do some Google searches and find some original footage and some replications of this, the participants showed a range of negative emotions about continuing, and some would plead with the learner, asking the actor to answer questions carefully. Others started to laugh nervously, and they would act rather strangely in different ways, and some appeared cold and hopeless and somber, and some thought that they'd actually killed the learner, and nevertheless, they continued to obey, discharging the full shock to the learners. And there was one man who wanted to abandon the experiment, who was told that the experiment must continue. And instead of challenging the decision of the experimenter, he proceeded repeating to himself, okay, it's got to go on, it's got to go on, it has to go on. So he was going along with this even after saying he wanted to stop the experiment. So Milgram's experiment included many different variations, and this isn't described in your book, but I think this is important when we think about social behavior and obedience. In one, the learner was not only visible, but teachers were asked to force the learner by hand or with his hand to the shock place so they could deliver the punishment. Less obedience was extracted from subjects in this case. So in another variation, teachers were instructed to apply whatever voltage they desired to incorrect answers. They were given choice, and teachers averaged about 83 volts, and a very small amount of participants, I think around 2.5%, went to the full 450 volts. So when they had to make the choice, they weren't very likely to administer high voltage at all. And this shows that most participants were good, average people, not really bad people, and that they were obeying only because of coercion. So in general, more submission was elicited from teachers when, here's some important things to remember, the authority figure was in close proximity, the teachers felt they could pass on responsibility, and experiments took place under the auspices of some respected organization. So think about Nazi Germany, and this is what, if you look in your textbook, what was originally getting Milgram interested in obedience. He wondered, why is it that people in Nazi Germany were willing to obey the orders of someone to do such heinous things? Was it that all of the people who obeyed those orders were terrible, evil people? Or was it that there may also be something else at work, the power of the situation, the presence of an authority figure? And so in Nazi Germany, what you find is that when people were killed, oftentimes, although not always, but oftentimes there was a distance between the person who was committing the atrocity and the victim. And so when there's a distance between those two, when there's a distance between those two in an experimental condition, like in the one we're talking about in Milgram's experiment, Milgram found that if he asked the teacher to shock someone who was in the same room as him or her, that the teacher was not likely at all to do so. It was when there was a wall or a partition or when someone was in another room that they were likely to administer those shocks. So think about this, and think about also, if you watch films about Nazi Germany, you'll notice that when someone who is in the position of potentially being, who's going to harm another person, who may be a Jewish person, a gypsy, or there are many other people who were killed in Nazi Germany. Think about the presence of that person committing the atrocities is in the films you've watched, sometimes the person who is committing the atrocity, they're doing so when the person who is over them is present, but they may have been less likely to do so when the person who is over them isn't present, and so when they have more freedom of choice. So I think it's important, although those are film examples. I think we can see how this might happen in real life. The presence of that authority figure, physically present right in front of you, telling you to do something, is very different from having that internal voice knowing that someone somewhere has told you need to do something. You're much less likely to obey in that situation. So finally, just wanted to mention that some of the, Milgram divided participants into 3 categories. Some obeyed and they justified themselves. So they transferred the blame onto the experimenter. You'll see that in the video clips that I shared with you. They may have, obeyed, but then they blame themselves. They feel badly when they've done what they had done. And, it may be that members in this group in the future, maybe they would be more likely to challenge authority in the future if confronted because they experienced that bad feeling. And then some rebelled. Some questioned the authority of the experimenter and argued that there was a greater ethical imperative calling on for the protection of the learner over the needs of the experimenter. So be sure to read about that study. Please let me know what questions you have as you read this chapter. I realize that this is a long audio review, but I wanted to make sure that you had a nice thorough review of each of these concepts as you're learning them. Again, let me know what questions you have, and thank you.